The Arizona sun was a merciless god, hammering the parched earth with a heat that shimmered in the air and baked the life from anything foolish enough to stand against it. For Arthur, this unforgiving landscape was a kind of penance, a self-imposed exile from a world that had taken everything from him. His ranch, a lonely speck of defiance against the vast, empty expanse, was more a fortress for his grief than a home. The clapboard house, weathered to a silver grey, stood sentinel over a handful of cattle, a dusty corral, and a well that was the lifeblood of his solitary existence. It had been 5 years since the fever had claimed his Martha and little Thomas, 5 years since the silence in the house had become a physical weight on his shoulders. Arthur moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who had nothing left to hurry for. At 35, his face was already a testament to hardship, etched with lines of sun and sorrow. His shoulders, broad from years of ranch work and the burdens of war, seemed permanently stooped, as if carrying the ghosts of his past. The clear blue of his eyes, once quick to smile, now held a permanent watchful distance. He was a man hollowed out, going through the motions of living because he hadn't yet found a reason to die. That afternoon, the sky began to change. The endless pale blue bled into a sickly yellow-brown at the horizon. The wind, which had been a hot, lazy breath, picked up a sudden, menacing whine. Arthur paused, his hand on the fence post, and sniffed the air. Dust. A storm was coming, one of the big ones that could strip paint from a barn and bury a fence line overnight. He moved with a newfound urgency, his long-practiced routines kicking in. He herded the nervous cattle into the relative safety of the small canyon behind the house, secured the shutters, and checked the rope leading from the back door to the well. In a whiteout of sand, a man could get lost 10 feet from his own porch. The storm hit not as a wave but as a wall. One moment he could see the distant mesas, stark and purple. The next, the world was gone, replaced by a roaring, suffocating vortex of sand and fury. The wind screamed like a banshee, rattling the very bones of his small cabin. Inside, the air grew thick with fine dust that seeped through every crack. Arthur sat at his rough-hewn table, a single lantern casting a flickering, golden glow, and listened to the tempest. It was a sound that matched the chaos in his own soul. He simply waited for it to pass, as he waited for everything else in his life. The storm raged for hours, a relentless assault that finally began to recede as dusk painted the churning sky in bruised shades of violet and orange. The wind lessened to a mournful sigh, and a strange, heavy silence fell over the land, broken only by the drip of water from the roof where a small leak had sprung. Arthur pushed open the door, the wood groaning in protest against a new dune of sand that had piled against it. The world outside was transformed, softened and reshaped by the storm. The air was cool and clean, washed by the sheer violence of the wind. It was his routine to check the creek first. The flash floods that often followed such storms could change its course or wash away the banks, and it was his only reliable source of water beyond the well. He grabbed his rifle out of habit. The land was always full of surprises, few of them pleasant, and made his way down the gentle slope. The creek was running high and muddy, clogged with debris. As he scanned the bank for damage, a patch of color caught his eye, a splash of deep turquoise and buckskin brown against the dun-colored mud, tangled in the roots of a fallen cottonwood. He approached cautiously, rifle held at the ready. It wasn't a coyote or a stray calf. It was a person, a woman. She was lying face down, half in the churning water, her body limp and unmoving. He waded into the cold, swirling creek, the mud sucking at his boots, and carefully turned her over. She was young, Apache by her dress and the fine high line of her cheekbones. Her black hair, long and thick, was matted with mud and leaves. A nasty gash, swollen and red, marred her temple, and her buckskin dress was torn at the shoulder. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck. A pulse, faint, thready, but there. Her skin was hot to the touch, a dry, dangerous heat that spoke of fever. She was small, looking almost like a girl, but there was a resilience in the set of her jaw, even in unconsciousness, that spoke of a woman's strength. Her face, though pale beneath her olive skin and smeared with dirt, was strikingly beautiful, but it was the terror etched around her closed eyes that struck him the most, a silent scream captured in the tense line of her brow. For a moment, Arthur hesitated. Bringing an Apache woman into his home was asking for a world of trouble. There was tension with the nearby reservation, and lone settlers were often caught in the middle. But to leave her here was a death sentence. He looked at her fragile form, at the way the rough current tugged at her clothes, and he saw not an Apache, not a stranger, but simply a human being at the ragged edge of existence. It was a place he knew all too well. The hollow space inside him ached with a forgotten pang of empathy. With a grunt, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a bird-like weight of bone and sinew. He carried her back up the slope, his boots sliding in the fresh mud, his own exhaustion forgotten in the face of this immediate, desperate need. Inside the cabin, he gently laid her on his own bed, the only soft place in the entire house. He lit another lamp, the room filling with a warmer light. He worked with a gentle efficiency that would have surprised anyone who knew the gruff, solitary rancher. He cleaned the gash on her temple with whiskey, she didn't even flinch, and bandaged it with a strip of clean linen torn from one of Martha's old aprons. He carefully removed her wet, torn moccasins and covered her with a thick wool blanket. For 2 days, she drifted in and out of a fevered delirium. Arthur sat by her side, patiently spooning water and then thin broth between her parched lips. He spoke to her in a low, soothing voice, not caring if she understood the words, only hoping the tone might offer some comfort in her fever dreams. He told her about the ranch, about the stubborn cow with one crooked horn, about the way the light hit the mesas at sunrise. He spoke more in those 2 days than he had in the last 2 years. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. He was sitting in his chair, dozing, when a small sound startled him awake. He looked over to the bed. She was awake, her eyes wide open, and they were fixed on him. They were the darkest eyes he had ever seen, deep and expressive, and right now they were filled with a raw, primal fear. She scrambled backwards on the bed, pressing herself against the headboard, her whole body trembling, her lips parted as if to scream. A ragged gasp of air filled her lungs, but no sound came out, only a choked, desperate silence. "Easy now," Arthur said softly, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Easy. You're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you." She watched his every move, her chest heaving. The terror in her eyes was a living thing, so potent he could almost feel it in the air between them. He understood then. The silence wasn't from choice or language. It was broken. The storm that had thrown her at his feet was nothing compared to the one that raged inside her. He stood slowly and walked to the door, opening it to the bright morning light. "See, you can leave whenever you're strong enough. You're not a prisoner." He turned back to look at her, and his gaze was drawn past her, through the small window on the far side of the cabin. Out on the horizon, miles away but clear in the crisp post-storm air, he saw them, 3 riders silhouetted against the rising sun. They were moving slowly, deliberately, their heads down as if scanning the ground. Trackers. His blood ran cold. She hadn't just been caught in a storm. She was being hunted. He looked from the distant riders back to the terrified woman in his bed. Her silent eyes followed his gaze to the window, and a fresh wave of panic washed over her face. In that moment, a choice was made. This was no longer about simple decency. This was about defiance. The world had tried to grind him down, to leave him with nothing, but it had left him this one thing, a stubborn refusal to let the wolves win. He had failed to protect his own family. He would not fail this stranger. He shut the door firmly, the sound echoing in the small cabin. He turned the lock. "Looks like you're staying with me for a while," he said, his voice low and steady, "and I'll be damned if I let them get to you." The days that followed settled into a strange and silent rhythm. The cabin, once a hollow monument to Arthur's loneliness, now held a fragile, shared existence. Nizhoni, the name he had decided to call the quiet woman in his care after finding a similar word in a worn book about native tribes meaning beautiful, was like a wild thing brought indoors, skittish, watchful, and radiating a silent, coiled tension. She moved about the small space with a fluid grace, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floorboards. She would not speak, could not speak, but her eyes spoke volumes. They followed Arthur constantly, dark pools of observation, searching for any hint of threat, any sign that his kindness was a mask for something more sinister. Arthur, for his part, moved with a deliberate, gentle patience he hadn't known he possessed. He had handled spooked horses and cornered cattle, and he treated her with the same cautious respect, giving her space, never moving too quickly. He would talk to her as he went about his chores, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to soothe the frayed edges of her nerves. He'd tell her about the mending that needed doing on the fence line, or how the well was getting low, filling the suffocating silence with the simple, mundane facts of his life. He expected no reply, and he received none. Yet, he felt her listening, Their communication was a clumsy dance of gesture and assumption. He'd hold up a dipper of water, raising an eyebrow in question. She would give a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He'd point to the stew simmering over the fire, and then to his own stomach, and she would understand. He learned the subtle language of her body. The slight stiffening of her shoulders meant fear. A softening of her jaw meant a moment of peace. A quick downward glance meant shame or sorrow. The desire to understand what horrors she had witnessed gnawed at him. He needed to know who was hunting her and why. One evening, after they had shared a meal of rabbit stew in their usual quiet, an idea struck him. He took a piece of charcoal from the edge of the hearth and found a clean, flat piece of kindling wood. He sat on the floor across from her, where she was huddled in a chair with one of his blankets wrapped around her. He held them out to her. "Can you show me?" he asked softly. Nizhoni stared at the charcoal as if it were a snake. Fear, sharp and immediate, flashed in her eyes. She shook her head, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Whatever she was holding inside was a beast she was terrified to unleash. "It's all right," Arthur said, his voice gentle. "Just anything. Anything you can." He placed the wood and charcoal on the floor between them and went back to cleaning his rifle, giving her the illusion of privacy. He watched her from the corner of his eye. For a long time she didn't move. Then slowly, like a fawn taking its first steps, she leaned forward. Her slender, dirt-stained fingers hesitantly picked up the charcoal. Her hand trembled as she touched it to the wood. The first lines were jagged and uncertain, but then something took over. Her hand steadied, moving with a desperate, frantic energy. She drew not a story, but fragments of a nightmare. The first image was a man's face, but she spent most of her effort on a single detail, a chain hanging from his waistcoat, at the end of which was a round object that gleamed, a silver pocket watch. The man's eyes were cold and empty, even in the crude charcoal rendering. Then she drew flames, tongues of fire licking at a structure of wood and hide, a wiki up. Finally, with tears welling in her eyes, she drew another face. It was an old man, his features lined with wisdom and kindness, but his mouth was open in a silent cry, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored her own. Arthur felt a cold knot form in his stomach. A man with a silver watch, a fire, a murdered elder. It wasn't just a story of escape, it was a story of murder and destruction. He looked at Nizhoni, who was now staring at the drawing, her body shaking with silent sobs. He moved toward her, slowly, and did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. She flinched, but she didn't pull away. The small point of contact seemed to anchor her, a small island of comfort in her sea of traumatic memory. The next day, Arthur knew he had to go to Redemption. Her bandage needed changing with something cleaner than torn strips of cloth, and his own supplies were running dangerously low. The thought of leaving her alone was unsettling. The image of the trackers on the horizon was burned into his mind. He spent the morning securing the cabin, barring the windows from the inside in a way that could be easily undone, and hiding her in the small, dark root cellar beneath the floorboards. "I'll only be a few hours," he promised, looking down at her through the open trapdoor. Her eyes were huge in the gloom. "No one will find you here. Don't make a sound." She gave a single, solemn nod. The ride to Redemption was tense. Every gust of wind, every distant hawk's cry sounded like a threat. The town was little more than a single dusty street, lined with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a sheriff's office that was more often empty than not. It was a place where people minded their own business, but secrets had a way of seeping into the dusty air. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the smell of coffee, leather, and chewing tobacco. While Otis, the portly storekeeper, gathered his supplies, flour, salt, coffee, and laudanum for medicine, Arthur leaned against the counter, pretending to inspect a display of knives. 2 cattlemen were talking by the stove, their voices low. "Told you, Cornelius isn't a man to cross," one of them said. "He wants that line through Apache lands, he's gonna get it. The railroad pays him to clear the path, and he does it. No questions asked." "Heard he's looking for someone," the other man chimed in, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "Some little Apache squaw. They say she knifed one of his men and stole a payroll box. Got a bounty on her head." Arthur's hand tightened on the handle of the knife he was holding. A thief? A murderer? It was a lie, a convenient story to turn the locals against her and justify his hunt. "Cornelius himself was through here yesterday," the first man continued. "Dressed like he was going to a Sunday meeting. Smooth talker, but his eyes are cold as a snake's. He was flashing around this fancy silver pocket watch, clicking it open and shut. Said he'd pay top dollar for any information on the girl. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Cornelius, the man from the railroad, the man with the silver pocket watch. The name hung in the air, heavy with menace. Arthur paid for his goods, his face an unreadable mask, and left the store. His gut was churning. This wasn't just a few trackers anymore. It was a powerful man with the weight of the railroad behind him, a man who could buy posses and spread lies as easily as he breathed. And he was close. The ride back to the ranch was a frantic race against the setting sun and the fears clawing at his mind. He burst through the cabin door, his heart pounding. "Nizhoni!" he called out, his voice hoarse. He threw open the trap door. She was huddled in the corner, safe. The relief that washed over him was so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He helped her out of the cellar, and she looked at his face, sensing his urgency and his fear. He took out the piece of wood again. He drew a crude representation of a train on tracks. Then he wrote a name in the dust on the floor, Cornelius. He pointed at the name. The reaction was instantaneous. A choked gasp escaped her lips, the first sound he had ever heard her make. The color drained from her face, and the terror in her eyes was more profound than anything he had seen before. She knew the name. He was the man from her nightmares. He was the man with the silver watch. That night, the cabin felt different. It was no longer a shelter but a besieged outpost. The bond between them, forged in silence and shared fear, had been tempered into something stronger. Arthur cleaned his rifle with grim determination, his mind racing through defensive strategies, recalling forgotten battlefield tactics. Nizhoni sat by the fire, sharpening a small knife she had kept hidden in her boot, her movements precise and deadly. They were no longer just a lonely rancher and a frightened refugee. They were partners, allies in a silent war against a ruthless enemy who was drawing closer with every tick of a silver pocket watch. And Arthur knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he would rather die here with her than let that man ever lay his hands on her again. The silence that had once been a companion to Arthur was now a coiled snake, a thing of perpetual tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind whistling through the eaves was a potential threat. 2 days passed in a state of high alert. They worked as a unit, a silent, efficient team preparing for a siege they both knew was inevitable. Arthur cleaned and oiled his weapons, the Winchester rifle he kept above the mantel, the Colt revolver that was a permanent fixture on his hip, and an old scattergun he'd kept from his army days. He reinforced the door with a heavy iron bar and filled every bucket and pot with water from the well, knowing a fire could be their most dangerous enemy. Nizhoni was his shadow. She moved with a purpose that belied her fear, her hands never idle. She tore strips from old flour sacks to make extra bandages and methodically laid out ammunition on the small table. She showed him how to wedge small stones into the window frames, creating tiny, almost invisible gaps to see and shoot through without exposing themselves. She was no damsel in distress. She was a survivor, and in her dark eyes, Arthur saw the same grim determination that fueled his own heart. The shared danger was erasing the line between protector and protected. They were now simply two people standing together against the coming dark. The attack came not at night, as Arthur had expected, but in the brazen heat of the midday sun. He was crouched at one of Nizhoni's peepholes when he saw the dust cloud, a telltale plume rising in the distance. 4 riders. They weren't trying to be stealthy. They were arrogant, confident. They rode as if they were coming to collect a debt, not to fight a battle. "They're here," he said, his voice a low growl. Nizhoni was instantly beside him, peering through another gap. She didn't flinch. Instead, she picked up the heavy scattergun, checked its load, and placed it on the table next to Arthur's position, ready for when the fight came in close. The riders fanned out as they approached, circling the cabin like vultures. They were rough men, their faces hard and weathered, pistols holstered high on their hips. One, a big man with a greasy beard, seemed to be the leader. He reined in his horse just outside of rifle range and cupped his hands around his mouth. "Arthur, we know you're in there. We know you've got the Apache girl. Cornelius wants what she stole. Send her out, and we'll leave you and your homestead in one piece." Arthur's jaw tightened. He laid the barrel of his Winchester on the windowsill, its sight fixed on the big man's chest. "She stole nothing," he yelled back, his voice cracking the stillness. "Ride out now, or you'll be carried out." A cruel laugh was his only answer. The men dismounted, using their horses for cover as they moved closer, spreading out to flank the cabin. The siege had begun. The first shot wasn't from Arthur. It was a crack of a pistol from one of the attackers, a bullet thudding into the log wall a foot from his head. He didn't hesitate. He took a steadying breath, squeezed the trigger, and his Winchester roared. The big man cried out, clutching a shoulder as he stumbled back behind his horse. The fight was on. For the next hour, the cabin was a vortex of noise and violence. Gunsmoke filled the small space, acrid and biting. Arthur was a machine of deadly efficiency. Years of military training, long dormant, came rushing back. He moved from window to window, never giving them a fixed target, making one man seem like three. He fired with a calm precision, each shot intended to wound, to disable, to drive them back. Nizhoni was a blur of motion at his side. As soon as his rifle was empty, another was in his hands, loaded and ready. She scanned the terrain from her own vantage point, her keen eyes picking out movement he might have missed. She would touch his arm, point, and he would fire. They were a seamless unit, a two-person army holding back the tide. One of the thugs managed to get close, taking cover behind the water trough. He was planning a rush for the door. The angle was bad for Arthur's rifle. Before he could switch positions, Nizhoni shoved the scattergun into his hands. He nodded, waited for the man to break cover, and fired. The blast was deafening, the kick of the gun jarring his wounded shoulder. The man was thrown backward out of the fight, but they were still 2 against 3, and the remaining attackers were learning. They stopped charging blindly and began using the terrain, taking cover behind the rocky outcrops that dotted the property. The shots became less frequent, more calculated. A tense waiting game began. It was during this lull, as the echo of the last gunshot faded, that the world inside Nizhoni's head fractured. The smell of gunpowder, the splintering of wood, the man's cry of pain. It was all a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut. A torrent of images, sharp and excruciatingly clear, flooded her mind. She was back in the camp, the firelight warm and comforting. She saw the elder Kos, his kind face crinkled in a smile as he traced lines onto a piece of cured deerskin, a map. He was showing her the secret places, the veins of the mother, the hidden silver mine that the ancestors had decreed was not to be disturbed. Then, the firelight was eclipsed by a shadow. Cornelius. His smile was a predator's baring of teeth. His silver watch gleamed. He wasn't there to talk. He wanted the map. Kos refused, and Cornelius's smile vanished. The sharp, brutal report of his pistol, Kos falling, the map clutched in his dying hand, Cornelius prying it from his fingers. Her own scream, a sound she thought she had lost forever, trapped in her throat as she fled into the night. The image of the stolen map and the gleam of that silver watch burned into her soul. She hadn't just seen a murder, she had seen the motive. She knew the secret he had killed for. A bullet smashed through the window, showering her with glass and yanking her back to the present. She gasped, a ragged, silent intake of air. Arthur looked at her, saw the change in her eyes, the raw horror mixed with a new, terrifying understanding. Nizhoni? Before she could react, one of the attackers made his move. He had managed to crawl up the blind side of the cabin and was now perched behind the woodpile, with a clear line of sight through the shattered window. He raised his rifle, the black hole of the barrel pointing directly at Arthur's back. Time slowed. Nizhoni's mind screamed a warning her voice could not deliver. She tried to move, to push him, but her limbs felt like lead. This was it. This good man who had saved her was going to die because of her. And then, a soundless whisper, a thwip that barely registered over the ringing in her ears. The man behind the woodpile stiffened. A look of stunned surprise crossed his face. He reached up to his neck, where the feathered shaft of an arrow now protruded, and then he crumpled to the ground without a sound. Arthur spun around, his rifle ready. He saw the dead man, the arrow, and looked out towards the rocks from where it must have come. A figure rose from behind a cluster of boulders. He was tall and lean, dressed in buckskin leggings and carrying a longbow. His movements were fluid and silent, like a mountain lion. He scanned the area, another arrow already knocked on his string. Nizhoni stumbled to the broken window, her eyes wide with disbelief. A single name echoed in the silent chambers of her heart. Sheila, her brother. The last remaining attacker, seeing his companions fall and a new deadly threat appear, fired one last panicked shot before scrambling for his horse and fleeing into the wilderness. The silence that descended was sudden and absolute, broken only by the buzzing of flies and the pounding of their own hearts. Arthur kept his rifle trained on the newcomer. Schuyler ignored him, his entire focus on the cabin, on the face of the woman in the window. Their eyes met across the dusty yard, a conversation of years of shared memories and months of desperate searching passing between them in a single, heart-stopping moment. Schuyler lowered his bow and began to walk towards the cabin. Arthur didn't lower his rifle. He had just fought off one group of hunters. He wasn't about to welcome another without knowing his intentions. He glanced at Nizhoni. She was trembling, but this time it was not from fear. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at her brother, her rescuer. She then turned her gaze to Arthur, and with a look of frantic appeal, she placed a hand on the barrel of his Winchester and gently, pleadingly, pushed it down. "He is not the enemy," her eyes screamed. "He is family." Arthur held Schuyler's gaze. The Apache warrior's eyes were hard, assessing Arthur, the cabin, the state of his sister. An uneasy truce settled over the blood-soaked yard. The immediate threat was gone, but a new, complex and dangerous chapter had just begun. The standoff in the dusty yard was a tableau of suspicion and exhaustion. Arthur's Winchester was pointed at the ground, but his grip was firm, his body coiled. Schuyler stood 20 yards away, his bow held loosely, his dark eyes flickering between the white man who had sheltered his sister and Nizhoni herself, who stood framed in the shattered window, a silent, desperate bridge between them. It was she who broke the impasse. She moved from the window, stepping carefully out the cabin door. She walked not to her brother, but to Arthur's side. She gently laid her hand on his forearm, a gesture of profound trust, and then turned her gaze back to Schuyler. Her message was clear, transmitted with a certainty that needed no words. "This man is my friend. He is my protector." Schuyler's hard expression softened almost imperceptibly. He had been tracking his sister for months, following a cold trail of rumors and fear. He had expected to find her captive, or worse. Instead, he found her alive, sheltered in the home of an armed settler who had just fought and bled to defend her. He saw the clean bandage on her temple, the blanket she wore, the way Arthur instinctively shifted his stance to keep his body between her and the dead men in the yard. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. The war between them was over before it had begun. The next few hours were a grim necessity. Schuyler, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man at home in the wilderness, helped Arthur drag the bodies of Cornelius's men away from the cabin. Communication was sparse, a language of gestures and shared understanding. Schuyler would point and Arthur would nod. They worked together, their animosity replaced by a mutual, unspoken respect forged in the crucible of combat. Later, inside the cabin, Nizhoni tended to a deep graze on Arthur's arm where a bullet had torn through his sleeve. As her gentle fingers cleaned the wound, Schuyler watched them. He saw the way Arthur's shoulders relaxed under her touch, the way her eyes, so often filled with terror, were now soft with concern. Schuyler spoke for the first time, his voice low and raspy, his English broken but clear. "He comes, the man with the shiny clock." Arthur looked up, meeting his gaze. "Cornelius." "Yes, the one who fled will bring him back." "He will bring many men," Schuyler stated, not as a question but as a fact. "This small house, it is a trap." "Then we won't wait for him here," Arthur replied, his mind already working, the old instincts of a soldier taking over. "We choose the ground." He looked to Schuyler. "There's a box canyon 2 miles east of here. Narrow entrance, high walls, a good place for an ambush." Schuyler's eyes lit with understanding. "A throat to choke," he agreed. They had a plan. The man who had fled would lead Cornelius right to the ranch. They would let him. They would make it look as though they were still holed up, preparing for a long siege. But they would be gone, waiting in the rocky heights of the canyon. Arthur explained his idea, using a piece of charcoal on the table to sketch the canyon's layout. Schuyler added to the drawing, marking the best positions for cover, the location of loose shale that could be turned into a rock slide, the paths the wind took through the rocks that would carry or muffle sound. Arthur brought the military tactics. Schuyler brought the land itself as their greatest weapon. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red, they made their move. They left a lantern burning in the cabin window, a beacon for their hunters. Then, under the cover of twilight, the 3 of them slipped out into the wilderness, Nizhoni moving as silently as her brother, a ghost in the growing shadows. They reached the canyon and took their positions. Arthur found a defensible ledge that gave him a clear view of the canyon floor, his rifle resting on a steady rock. Schuyler and Nizhoni climbed higher, melting into the rocks on the opposite wall like spirits of the mountain. From there, Shyla could signal the moment to unleash the rock slide they had prepared. They didn't have to wait long. Just after dawn, a party of 6 riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon, led by a well-dressed man on a fine black horse, Cornelius. He rode with an air of supreme confidence, his silver watch glinting in the morning sun. The coward who had fled was with them, pointing towards the canyon floor as the obvious path to circle around and approach the ranch from behind. They rode into the trap. When they were halfway through the narrowest point, Shyla gave the signal, the cry of a red-tailed hawk. It was Arthur's cue. His first shot echoed like a thunderclap in the enclosed space, and Cornelius's horse screamed and fell, pinning its rider's leg. The ambush exploded into chaos. From above, Shyla sent a volley of arrows into their midst, silent, deadly messengers that found their marks with terrifying accuracy. The thugs, caught completely by surprise in the tight confines, panicked, firing wildly at the rocks. Arthur's rifle barked again and again, his shots ricocheting off the stone walls, creating a deadly crossfire. The rock slide came next, a thunderous roar as tons of shale and stone cascaded down the canyon wall, cutting off any chance of retreat and taking another of Cornelius's men with it. Within minutes, it was over. The surviving men threw down their guns, their hands in the air. But Cornelius, driven by a desperate rage, managed to pull himself free from his dead horse. He saw a figure moving in the rocks above, Nizhoni. In a final cowardly act, he scrambled up the scree slope, grabbing her and pulling her in front of him. The cold barrel of his revolver pressed against her temple. "Drop your weapons!" he shrieked, his voice thin and hysterical, his charming facade stripped away to reveal the sniveling monster beneath. "Or she dies." Arthur's heart stopped. He had a clear shot, but the risk was unthinkable. Shyla stood frozen on the opposite cliff, his bow useless, his face a mask of fury and despair. "I should have known a savage would be too stupid to stay hidden," Cornelius sneered, tightening his grip on Nizhoni. He looked down at Arthur, a triumphant, crazed look in his eyes. "Now, rancher, you will watch as I finish what I started." He began to cock the hammer of his pistol. He was going to kill her anyway. He was going to kill her right in front of them. In that moment, watching the life of the man who had shown her such kindness about to be extinguished by her own capture, something inside Nizhoni snapped. The years of trauma, the frozen grief, the silent terror, it all coalesced into a single point of white-hot rage. The dam in her throat didn't just break, it exploded. A sound ripped from her, so raw and powerful, it seemed to shake the very stones of the canyon. It wasn't a word. It was a scream of pure, primal fury and accusation. It was the voice of the murdered elder, the cry of her violated people, the roar of her own spirit refusing to be silenced any longer. "No!" The sound was so unexpected, so powerful, that Cornelius flinched, his eyes widening in shock. For a fraction of a second, his grip loosened, the gun barrel wavering. It was all the opening Arthur needed. His rifle fired. The shot was perfect. The bullet struck Cornelius's gun hand, sending the revolver flying. At the same instant, Shyla was moving, descending the cliff face with breathtaking speed. Nizhoni, empowered by her own voice, drove her elbow back into Cornelius's ribs with all her might. He staggered back, gasping, just as Shyla slammed into him, and the 2 men tumbled to the canyon floor. Just then another group of riders appeared at the canyon's mouth, but these were not thugs. They were led by the sheriff from Redemption. Arthur had taken a gamble on his way to town days earlier, leaving a message with a neighboring rancher to fetch the law if he hadn't returned in 3 days. The fight was over. The sheriff and his posse took the wounded and whimpering Cornelius and his remaining men into custody. The stolen map was found in Cornelius's inner pocket, irrefutable proof of his motive. In the quiet aftermath, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Shyla approached Arthur. He looked at his sister, who stood beside the rancher, no longer hiding behind him, but standing with him. She was bruised and shaken, but her eyes held a new light, a strength that had been rekindled. "She chose her path," Shyla said, his gaze steady and filled with a deep, knowing wisdom. He looked at Arthur. "You are a man of honor. You fought for my sister. My family owes you a debt." He placed a hand on his own heart, then extended it towards Arthur. It was a blessing. Shyla would return to his people, a hero who had found his lost sister and brought a murderer to justice. But Nizhoni's journey was here, now. She turned to Arthur, her dark eyes shining with unshed tears. He saw his own reflection in them, No longer a hollow man, but someone whole again. "Arthur," she whispered, testing the name on her tongue. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. The silence that fell between them was no longer empty or frightening. It was a comfortable, peaceful quiet, filled with the promise of 1,000 shared sunrises, of a future to be built together, voice by voice, word by word, from the ashes of their lonely pasts.